I'm going to try it with this microphone. Is that on? Is it doing anything?
No.
It doesn't seem to be doing anything. Is that right? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, testing.
There you go.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, maybe that'll do it. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks, Jamie, very much. And the first thing I'd like to say is my congratulations and deep gratitude to you, Jamie, for picking up the burden following the loss, first of Stephen and then of Bob. So we are deeply indebted to Jamie for the continuation of this effort. So where is he anyway? There he is. Thank you, Jamie.
So you made it?
I think this is on now. Is that right?
Yeah.
So we're okay?
Good too.
Okay, good.
Good.
All right, well, what I'm going to do is to talk through some of the basics as I've presented them to a variety of audiences in the past. You're a little different because some of you know more about this stuff than I do, as a matter of fact. You've been with it longer, and some of you are newer to it. So I will kind of do what I do for anything, but I've got it modified a little. Okay, so let's see where I go here. How do I get this into advance? Doesn't work. Okay, everybody knows the money supply continues to rise, and it rises exponentially over time. And this is just the Federal Reserve data from that over this period of time up through past 2016. So this is the rise in the monetary supply. So it's over a $750 billion rise within the last year. And so the question is, let me see. Why won't this respond? Let's try this again. I'm seeing it on my screen, but it's not following this. I don't know. Paul, you might be able to help me, or somebody who...
PC first. So it's not following your...
Right. So, you know, I was kind of clicking this, and there's clicking this, but it's not following. I need to be in this light mode. It didn't work out, that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, maybe that's something
Come back here. Okay, I think you got it under control.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Howard. Okay, so this large amount of money. So what I always do in talking with an audience who doesn't know anything about this, I say, okay, we're going to take a little quiz here. Here's the questions. So how many of you choose A, that the federal government creates most of this new money? How many of you know? I get a few hands. Federal Reserve banks get a few hands. Banks, we have our checking accounts, for instance, get a few hands. And then D, I don't have a clue, and I get a lot of hands.
Yeah, right.
That's sort of where I start talking with folks. So the point is here is really money comes from either one of two sources. It either comes created by the government or it comes created by banks. And the fact is, we have both systems. We have two separate systems of money creation. We have a system of coin collection, which is sovereign money. It's created by the government, not as debt, but it's spent into circulation. They make 4 quarters, they can take it to the bank, get $1, and buy a cup of coffee. Okay, so that's money that's created by the government in the form of coins. But as you know, coins are a tiny fraction of the total amount of money that's out there. So what about the rest? Well, the rest is in effect created by banks as they make loans in the form of credit. So it's not money that is like coins, which stays forever in circulation, but it's credit which is given for a period of time until you pay it back and then it's all gone. Okay? So it's money, it's credit that's used as money. Okay? So more than, at least 95% of our money is this account money that's created by banks. We can talk about bills, that's complicated, and we'll leave that for another time. Okay, so as I say here, the remainder here is done by banks. So the question is, how the heck do banks create money? What do they do? Just pull out of the air? Okay, how do they do that? And in order to answer that question, you really have to understand something about bank balance sheets, of how the accounting system works in banks. And it's not all that complicated in principle, although if you put a lot of stuff in there, it can look complicated. But basically, there are 2 columns. The one on the left is the assets column. That's what the banks own, or what is owed to the banks. Okay? And on the right is what the bank owes to other people. Okay? So assets, what are the bank assets? Well, there are several forms, and there are really 2 different categories of assets, and I've listed those as liquid and illiquid. So liquid assets are money that the bank has that it can use right away, that it has access to. Bingo. Okay? So it's cash. They have some cash there. And it's also central reserves. And central reserves is the account that every bank has with the Fed, or the corresponding organization for credit unions. Okay? So every bank has a bank account with a central bank. Right? So that's what we call reserves. Oftentimes what you'll see is those 2 things, cash and central reserves, are considered in essentially a single category because they're both totally liquid. They can be used right then by the bank, loaned out or spent in any way they want to. Okay? They also own bonds. These are government securities. Okay? So treasury bills, treasury notes, this kind of thing. And so those are pretty liquid too because they can sell them off pretty quickly if they need cash to loan out. But they're not quite as liquid as cash and central reserves. And finally, they have a lot of assets now in the form of loans that they have essentially lent. Okay? It's an asset not because they have the money. It's an asset because they're going to get the money. Okay? So those are the assets. On the liability side, there are really 2 major categories, and that's customer deposits. And you can think of that in a number of ways, and we'll talk about what those consist of. But, you know, you make a deposit in your bank account, and that column rises. The bank has more deposits because you made a deposit in the bank. Okay, so that's a customer deposits. And the other is stockholder equity. Sometimes it's referred to as capital. It's another word that's used for that same thing. It's what investors have put into the bank to start the bank, basically, or to invest in it further. Okay, so that's what a balance sheet looks like. Now here's a real balance sheet that's a bank balance sheet of all the banks in the country as of December 2013. And again, you see these same categories that we just talked about. The big one on the left in terms of assets is loans. There are 4 different kinds of loans listed under the loan category, and you can see that those add up to the bulk, essentially, of the total assets, which are 11 trillion, 786 billion. So you add up those 4 numbers under commercial, industrial loans, real estate loans, consumer loans, all of the loans and leases, and that's the majority of that. The other things they have in terms of assets are they have some securities, those are at the top, so those are the government bonds and so on they own. And another major one down here is cash assets, and that includes, in this way of reckoning, reserves. Okay, they're the same, cash assets. Okay, and finally they have other assets, and that's the hardware, that's the buildings and so on. That's what they own in the physical world. And then on the right-hand side, the deposits again. The major thing here again you see is under deposits, basically, with 8 trillion there being the bulk of the total 11 trillion. That's the rest of it. Okay, and you'll see there's some borrowings. The banks borrow. We'll come back to that again. So they have some money that they borrowed, and that's part of their deposits too. So that's the big picture then of a bank balance sheet. Okay, so now let's look at a different representation of a bank balance sheet that describes what happens when a bank makes a loan. Okay, so now we have a histogram instead of a table like you were just looking at. But if you look at the far left over there, I can just come over here. If you look at the far left over here, let's just look at these two columns. This represents a bank. In this particular case, it's the bank that is going to make the loan. So it's the buyer's bank, because the buyer's going to buy a house or whatever with this money he's going to borrow. So what's represented here in the asset column is just reserves and currency. So this doesn't include loans, which they've already given out. It's just not included because it's not relevant for this particular consideration. Okay, so it's a partial representation of the bank balance sheet. And so we have two banks represented here that are going to be involved. One is the bank that's going to give the loan to the buyer, but the buyer is going to take that check, give it to the seller, who's going to deposit in his bank. So we got two banks involved in this, all right? So what we see is the person goes in to get this loan, and the first thing that happens is represented by the rise in the balance sheet of the lending bank, okay? What happens is the bank says, okay, we'll give you a loan, you're good credit, so what we're going to do is we're going to essentially increase the amount of money in your bank account. We're going to increase your deposits by the amount of the loan, okay? So a new deposit is created, and it's created simply by putting numbers in an account. There's no money transferred here, it's just numbers in an account, okay? So and when they set up this loan, they will not only have this new deposit that they've created for the customer to use to buy the house, okay? They will also have a new asset because he's going to have to pay that money back, okay? So this is the first step of this process, and right away you can see that there's an increase in the bank balance statements. There's a net increase. What that means is there's been money that's been created at that point, okay? Because the money supply, the way the money supply is measured is basically the amount of cash that we have out in circulation and the amount of deposits that we have in the bank, okay? And deposits are the big part of that, all right? So right away we see the deposits have risen, so that means the money supply has in fact increased. Now what happens here is the transfer of this money to the other bank. And it's going to go because the check is going to be passed to the seller, and the seller is going to take the check to the bank, and the bank says, oh, we got a new deposit. Okay? They just got a check in their hand, but they say, oh, that's going to indicate we get a new deposit. But when they get the money is, in fact, when the reserves are transferred, and that happens through some kind of a clearinghouse, and often central banks, including the Fed, have accomplished this function in the past. So what the bank does here, that's received this, they got this check and said, hey, Federal Reserve, we want you to transfer some money from that other bank into our account, so we have this money as cash reserves. Okay? So that's the clearinghouse function of the central bank. Okay? So what you can see is this new deposit ends up over into the other bank, okay? And the transfer of assets, of reserves has gone on too, from this bank to that bank. Now, this bank will have the same assets that it had before, but now, some of these assets are illiquid. They've been loaned out, okay? So those, new loan displaces these reserves because those reserves then have gone over to the other bank, okay? So you can see the reserves are up here. So the money supply has gone up now because the sum total of deposits of the two banks have undergone a net increase, okay? The two are over here at this point, and now we have the sum of these two increased by the amount of the new deposit. So that's the way basically a bank loan works. And every bank loan done increases the money supply, okay? Every bank loan. Now, when you and I loan to our brother $10, we don't create money. But the banks have a different accounting system that allows them to do this, basically. It's depository institutions that do this, and only depository institutions that do this. Okay. Okay. Let me show you one other thing here, and this is sort of redundant, but what I want to show you is that this money transfer between banks is going on all the time, every day. Lots of transfers, loans going from one place and then being deposited in another bank. And so what's illustrated here is the same kind of thing with two banks, one bank here and one bank illustrated above. And what you see is a column on the left, again, which is assets column, or reserves, okay? So these are the reserves, and so this bank is shown as all reserves with no loans out, again, because it's not helpful. It doesn't matter for this presentation. Okay, and here is then the deposits here. So the this bank makes a loan, and it's going to go to the other bank that's up there, and you can see that the intermediate step is not, that I showed you in the last slide, is not indicated here. Just the net result of this transfer. So the money has gone from bank one, who created it, and deposited it in the bank number two above. So then you can imagine the bank number two above giving a loan to somebody else who's going to buy something from somebody who has an account in bank one. So the money then, and the next loan is going in the opposite direction, from bank two to bank one. And so that one increases essentially the bank balance sheet here, both the deposits and the liabilities and the assets has gone up because of that money flowing in that's been created by that bank. So you can see this is just a sequential operation. And we've illustrated here 4 of these loans, and with 4 of these loans, what we've seen is the total money supply has gone from a sum total of 8 blocks over here, okay, the sum of this and the sum of that, to a sum total of 12 blocks with just 4 loans. So again, since this money is always going back and forth between banks like this, you can see how this process essentially creates this rise in the money supply that's exponential over time. Okay. But as banks lend, you saw it in the last slide. Let me go back here. As banks lend, the liquidity, their total liquidity, started out 4 here, and it ends up with 4. They don't lose any liquidity by this process, okay? But if you look at the liquidity as a fraction of their total, what you can see here, their reserves were essentially 100% of the total, okay? And now the reserves have gone down to 2/3 of the total, okay? So because they've lost part of the reserves by making these loans, okay? So what you can see was, if we carry this out, sequential loans, sequential loans, sequential loans, ultimately this yellow part is going to rise and rise and rise as the total goes way up through the ceiling, and you're going to be able to get to the place where the bank still has the same absolute liquidity, but now 95% of it is non-liquid, that they've only got 5% liquid. And then they hit the law, the regulation, which says that banks have to keep a certain amount of liquidity, okay? What's that? Oh, I lost it. Oh, I see. This isn't doing very good scraping on the floor. We'll try it. Maybe it was tickling my beard. Well, let it tickle. Okay, we'll try that. Thank you, Jamie. So this process in principle can go on forever unless there's a minimum reserve requirement. If there is a minimum reserve requirement, it will be encountered here, whether it's 5% or whether it's 1%, and it's different in Europe than it is in this country. And if you didn't have any minimum reserve requirement, you could keep doing this forever. Okay, nothing to stop. So there is a minimum reserve requirement, at least in this country. Okay? So what happens then to a bank that has done a lot of lending and they have begun to encounter this limit? All right? Well, what happens is that if the bank is in that situation, they borrow money. Okay? They borrow money from wherever they can borrow it from. They overnight it oftentimes, they borrow it just overnight from other banks. Because one bank will have a really good day lending and its reserves will go down, and another bank didn't do much lending that day but had a lot of deposits, got a lot of extra reserves, are happy to lend it to the one bank because they make some money, they charge them for that. So this kind of lending goes on. And also, ultimately, they can borrow from the central bank. So when this happens, what you see here is here's a bank who's approaching this minimum reserve. It's got very little reserve left, so all the rest of the stuff is out in loans. Okay? So what it does is say, help, we need to borrow money, and they borrow it from somewhere, and so they get this new deposit. It's a loan to them. Okay? And this is a deposit that they count as a deposit, and it's a new asset for them. It's liquid money, and they can go on and continue to lend because that's gotten them away from that minimum required reserve. Okay? Okay. So, you might ask the question, I'm going to do this quickly, it's potentially complicated, but the point is the central bank, whenever it makes loans, it basically does the same thing commercial banks do when they make loans. It creates it out of nothing. The money that the central bank is creating is reserves, unlike the bank money, okay? But it's the same process. So what you see is, as a result of the central bank having given a loan to a commercial bank, the bank balance statement of the central bank rises. Okay? They have created new money. They've created new reserves, which provide a backup, essentially, for the creation of bank money that you and I use. Okay? Again, I'll do this quickly. This is the same figure you saw before, but the arrows are reduced. And this is an important point for people learning about this, because we make this assertion, well, when you pay your money back, you pay the loan back, that money disappears. And somebody says, huh, if I take a $10 bill as a payment on loan, it disappears? How can it disappear? It's still a $10 bill. Right. This is often a little hurdle to understand. But the way to understand it is basically, again, the use of these bank balance statements. So what's happening is that the guy who has is going to essentially make a loan payment. And so let's say he has a loan out from Bank 2, but he has also an account in Bank 1. So he writes a check to pay that bank back. Okay? And when he writes that check, then that check goes into that bank. And what the bank does is say, oh, this check now represents money to essentially extinguish that loan. The loan goes to zero because it's paid back. So now what we get is this money that's paid in this direction essentially replaces that loan. So you can see there were two loans out over here, and now one of them has been paid back. Okay? So that's where the money goes. And the net result of that is that as this process proceeds sequentially, and you can think your way through it, I'm not going to spend more time on it, but it turns out you get back to this situation. In other words, we've done this in reverse and we lose the money. Money supply has gone down. So when repayments of loans predominate, the money supply goes down. When lending predominates, the money supply goes up. Okay, so this is then the big picture, that we have money in the economy because of lending by the financial sector, by the banks, and of course it's being paid back. And if this arrow goes faster than the other arrow over there, the money supply is rising for the economy. And if that one turns out, if this one slows down, so prepayment then exceeds the rate of lending, then the money supply is going down. So that's how the money supply varies. Okay. But of course, we've totally ignored a big factor, interest. Okay, so the point is the economy borrows this money and it has to pay it back, but it has to pay back more than it borrowed. The interest, where does it get it? Well, you know, if you think about this as an individual, well, you go out and take a second job to borrow back. But we're talking about macro here. We're talking about the whole economy. Where does the economy get it to pay more back than the banks have created? There is only one source of new money. What is it? New loans. Right. So it simply demands more loans. And if you look at this sequentially, you can do an interesting little thought experiment here. Let's say you're starting a new economy, so you borrow $100 from the bank because you're going to do this kind of money supply that we have. The banks give it on loan. So we borrow $100. At the end of that time, of course, we have to scrape up all that money, even though it's been circulating in our economy, take it back to the bank to say, yeah, we're going to pay you back. And the banker says, fine. Where's the extra $10? Okay, that's with interest. I think we'll have to get that by asking for another loan. So we'll do another loan to keep the $100 in here, but we're not going to have to borrow this time instead of 100. We're going to have to borrow 110 because 10 is going back to you guys in the bank as part of your interest. Okay? So this process again goes sequentially. So in order to maintain a continuous supply of money in the real economy, money is being siphoned off essentially into the financial sector, and that is what causes this exponential process of increasing in the money supply. So there's the money supply. It's the same shaped curve. I showed you that before. Okay, so in the debt money system, then, to keep a constant money supply in the economy, the total money supply rises exponentially as money is filtered off into the financial sector. The steepness of the exponential rise is primarily a function of interest rates. And a banker will argue, well, wait a minute, we in the financial section, it doesn't stay there. We pay our employees, you know, so that goes back into the real economy, all of which is true. But overall, the net process the banker, because he's well paid, spends a smaller fraction of his paycheck at the grocery store than does his employee, all right? So the fact is that the financial sector, being well paid, only filters a fraction of that back into the real economy, and it tends to stay in the economy. And in what form does it stay in the economy? Where is it? It's assets, it's stocks, it's investments of various kinds. Okay, that's where it is. Okay, so we might ask, yeah, John.
So these are assets. It goes into assets, you said.
Yeah.
Stephen always pointed out the important thing was which assets, because money gets directed by various powers, and if it's all directed into a dot-com bubble, then you end up with a dot-com bubble.
Exactly. It's absolutely right. But what you can see is what's happened since 2008, the stock market has gone up. It's absorbed a lot of that money. The money that did go into investing in additional factories or farms or any productive thing, that's good. Okay? It doesn't contribute to this. That comes back into the real economy. So thank you. That's an absolutely important point, John. Okay. So anyway, why is this increasing money supply, a problem if indeed we're maintaining the money supply okay in the real economy? Well, the fact is, as money supply in the financial sector increases and it raises prices there, for stock prices, real estate, and so on, that filters into the real economy because increasing real estate prices means increase in housing costs. And once you've got an increase in housing costs, that affects everybody. And so it requires increases in wages in order to cover these costs. And so on. So that's how this inflation, starting in the financial sector, ultimately filters into the entire economy. And in fact, this inflation is built into the present system. There has to be inflation for the system to continue. Okay? And that's the reason why all governments have inflation targets. All central banks have inflation targets. They have to have inflation to keep the system afloat because of this exponentially rising pattern of the money supply and what that does to the economy. So central banks have to keep the money supply increasing fast enough through bank lending to sustain the system. It'll be driven by bank lending, and the central bank is the backup for it. So what's wrong with inflation? Well, I think all of you can answer that question. But the problem is with inflation, of course, is it's bad for holders of money, and it's bad for those on fixed incomes. But holders of money have another out, because what they can do is invest that money that they're holding into something whose value is rising faster than inflation. So they can put it in the stock market or some other place where they can essentially make money on the fact that inflation is occurring. Okay? The poor and the middle class don't have that option. Okay? And so you get this, this maldistribution of wealth. It's a fundamental consequence of this money system that we have. And there are many descriptions of this in the literature, and I don't have to go through this, but the top 10% of the left three columns there, you can see hold about 75% of the wealth, according to this particular set of data, and there's other data sets that are similar to it. So what are the consequences of this present money system? We've got growth, we've got prosperity, it is argued, but at a price. What is the price we paid for it? We've got an extreme concentration of wealth, with the interest paid on every dollar in circulation. It's socially destabilizing. We'll catch up with us one day. We have austerity in the public sector, because new money doesn't go for public works. We have boom and bust cycles of the economy, which benefit the rich always, whether you're in boom or bust. Okay? It creates massive debt, okay, public and private. Now, there are a lot of alternatives that have been proposed. People have different favorites and so on. And I'm not going to talk about those because most of those really don't address the problem, because the only one that does really address the problem that we've talked about is, in fact, a sovereign money system that is incorporated into the Need Act. So how would the Need Act address the problems? Well, extreme concentration of wealth. The Need Act ends the flow of money from the public to the lenders that's associated with the creation of money itself. Okay? And that's at least $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. And also, it ends this flow of money to the wealthy because it ends paying the federal debt. But the federal debt is basically a transfer of money from all of us taxpayers to those people wealthy enough to lend money to the government. Okay? So it puts the lid at the top. But perhaps more importantly, it boosts the bottom because of the capability that it gives the government to essentially underwrite the things that we need, the kinds of things that were done during that remarkable period between 1935 and 1980 when we got the Social Security Act, we got funding for education, we got the GI Bill, these kinds of things. So this Need Act provides the vehicle by which that can be done. Otherwise, people say, no, you can't do that because we don't have the money. Money's easy to create. Okay? So, and the austerity of the public sector, this is the point, of course, that where will the money come from? The stopper for any proposed bidding proposal, it's gone. Okay? Money's going to come from this creation, and as long as it goes into production of goods and services, it produces no inflation. Okay? Boom bust cycles of the economy. The Need Act essentially takes away the causes. It removes the current pro-cyclic behavior, both in the boom phase and the bust phase. Okay? Creation of massive debt. Well, the Need Act decouples money creation from debt. Okay? So increased debt levels will no longer be required to expand the money supply. Okay? So, and government debt will disappear as well. And increased incomes from middle class and lower will permit them to pay down their private debt or at least do things without increasing their own levels of debt. I'm going to skip this. This is because of time. But maybe we can come back to this at another time. What it is how the bank balance statements would be different under the NEED Act. Okay, but we'll come back to that. I want to close with a couple of problems. And the first problem I want to mention is the growth problem. The NEED Act will stimulate growth. Benison-Kumhov's analysis, for instance, says 10% growth right off the bat. Growth in many areas is needed. A lot of people need to live better. They need to be able to consume more, okay? But the finite planet cannot tolerate continued overall growth of resource consumption and waste production faster than the Earth can provide and buffer them. And we're talking about resources like waters and aquifers, fresh water and food supply. We're talking about waste production, like the production of CO2 and other pollutants of the air and our water systems. So the NEED Act itself does not address the growth problem, okay? But it makes it possible for the world to do so because the present system requires GDP growth to sustain itself from collapse. The NEED Act provides a system which can accommodate GDP growth, leveling off, or decline without any difficulty, without any disruption, without any collapse. It's totally capable of doing that. So the NEED Act is absolutely essential for sustainability of the world we live in. So the conclusions here are straightforward. The NEED Act, in a sense, is not an in and of itself. It's a means to a just and sustainable economy. There are a lot of other things that contribute to this, in addition to the monetary supply. Corporate control, not only over money creation, but over elections, over knowledge dissemination in the media, schools and universities, over healthcare, over agriculture, over the world's natural resources, including land, air, and water. Somehow, this corporate control has got to be scaled back in order to have it under more public control, okay? Now, there are a lot of people working on these issues. There are various groups that work on these issues, and some of us work on multiple issues, this one and others, whether it's healthcare or environmental issues and so on. So all of us are allies in this, and our task is essentially to convince them of the essentiality of our own rightness, of our own cause, that is to say, monetary reform. But in order to do that and be effective at doing that, we have to understand and acknowledge and indeed celebrate the rightness of these other efforts that people are trying to make in the system. So the whole thing can work together, hopefully, so we can actually make real steps toward this goal, which is a future that is just and sustainable. I preached enough.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. Now, we do have a little bit of time for a few questions, and then if there's other questions that you don't get to right now, we're going to have a panel at the end where you can ask those as well. So I'll walk around the microphone. Is there any pressing questions based on John's presentation? Okay.
Oh, can you go back to a slide? Is that possible? You don't have to. Like the one, like the third slide.
So
where you,
that's something that sort of banking system has to play a issue.
Can you have
The system, but if you see
Sure.
Third slide.
Well, it's the one with the green blocks. Maybe it's way up. Maybe it's further than that. So you were showing how to transfer.
Oh yeah, the lending process.
Yeah, that.
Somewhere in there.
The one with the green and the red blocks.
This one?
No, the one above. Well, that one above is better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go.
I just wanted to point out this. I find things confuse me. Don't seem to confuse other people. But that big white block there, that new loan, I think in actuality, it's a thin sliver on any given day or any given week.
True.
It's Because the way it looks there is, bank makes one loan and it's insolvent, you know? So for helping me understand that this process can actually sustain itself, it's just a small sliver of new loans going out. Another thing that I don't hear talked about much is that the rate at which loans goes out is tremendous. You know, you can think on any one month, there may be, a bank may be lending $500,000 or $1 million, but they're only getting back a small portion of loans repaid because mortgages are amortized over a long time. So I think of a bathtub with a big gushing faucet and a kind of clogged drain, and that's another reason why the money supply is increasing, because the supposed annihilation of money is happening much more slowly than the creation of money. So it's real money out there that lingers there a long time in the economy. Very often people say, well, money is destroyed as it's created, so it's not real money. But it's real because it's used for transactions, and it just lingers in the economy for a long time. Another question I have, and maybe this will be answered later on, there's apparently $2 trillion that the Fed bought from banks when they did quantitative easing where they purchased these toxic assets. And I want to know, when the need act happens, what happens to that $2 trillion in reserves that appeared over the last 10 years? Where's that money going to go back to? So, I don't know if you have the answer, David does, or...
You guys, to me,
Jamie?
repeat the question.
It goes to me. Well, this is one of these things that a little bit of a disagreement with me and Joe on this one. But, we're going to work that out. But, my opinion is that...
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, what happens to all of the assets that the Fed purchased for the quantitative easing? Well, I mean, those are tapering off at the moment. They're not being replaced or replenished, so they may not be there. You know, if and when the need act was implemented, they may not be there. But right now, in previous years, previous conferences, I've done presentations of what could happen with that, and I suggested that they could be sold back into the market as like the last chance for insurance companies and pension funds to buy some treasuries and hold them, and they may go at a premium, and the proceeds for that could go and fund the initial citizens' dividend as part of the NEED Act, and could also be used to clear student debt. Joe has a different opinion on that, and we'll probably cover that in the panel at the end of the day. It's one of these things we mean to... In May in Utrecht, we were at a conference, and we had an accountant there, and Joe and I were meaning to ask him about this. Where I live in the UK, my friend's daughter is an accountant, and I asked her, and she suggested that it would be okay, what I was suggesting, but yeah. But anyway, anyone else want more questions that aren't so easy?
More questions?
There's one back there.
Hi, John. This is Mike White. I was just wondering what you thought about the Consumer Price Index as a statistic and its veracity in regards to inflation numbers in general.
I certainly can't give an authoritative answer on that. It seems to me all those estimates that are made for ostensibly for useful purposes have difficulties in terms of their accuracy. It's like the question of the gross national product and so on, gross domestic product. So the price, what the economists do is they kind of select a bunch of a bunch of items that they're going to put in their market basket, and they're going to use that as a measure of the consumer price index. And how accurate that choice is, I think, is sometimes open to question. But other than that, I don't really have any sort of feeling about it affecting things one way or another. But maybe they do. I don't know.
I just wondered if you had any insight into how the infrastructure of the U.S. was built out, like the interstate highway system and all that. All that happened after 1913. And that's when this system was instituted. What is different about today's situation where we can't seem to get anything done versus where it was back, you know, after 1913 when all this was accomplished using the same system, I think?
It was. And that's a good question, and it's one I've struggled with. And my own sort of thinking about it is that the pattern here is this exponential rise, okay, the system. So the question is, when does the rate of exponential rise become lethal? You know, biological things have exponential rise during the growth phase and they level off, you know. This has no leveling off, so it has no way to keep itself under control. So it just seems to me that somehow we've passed gradually into some threshold of this system being counterproductive. You know, I'd like to say another thing about this business of paying under the Need Act. It says something in the Need Act that the reserves of individual banks will be paid back. But it doesn't say how it's going to do this. It simply leaves it to the monetary authority, which was probably wise. But if you think about paying back the reserves as the government buys the Federal Reserve System, there's a very curious conclusion. Because let's say they create the money to buy the reserves from, let's say, one particular bank, okay? So now that bank gets this payment. So what it does is it increases its assets and liabilities, because that's a loan. Well, it increases its assets, getting payment. But in increasing its assets, now it can essentially use those assets to pay off the loan. So in buying the reserves back, the government is paying itself. It's not a net flow to the banks at all. So I didn't have time. I've only thought about this just in the last few days, since the coffee house conversation, actually, and I haven't had a chance to sort of diagram the thing and make it clear. But maybe we can talk about that further.
Excuse me, Howard Schweitzer. I had a couple of things now because of this good question that happened over here. Thinking about what happened since 1913. And of course, we had a bubble that was blown up as soon as they got a chance to do that. And then that bubble burst, and we call it the Great Depression. And then that lasted a while until really World War II came along. And then World War II production just skyrocketed because there was money going into it. I remember my father, who had lived through Depression, was just totally in awe of that level of production that happened. But post-war, we had a tax structure that I think was more progressive. And so that's when all that big development in the highway system and all of that kind of stuff, all that infrastructure was built out, a lot of it. And that's what I was thinking, an answer to that question. But I was wondering what John thought of when we talk about the business cycle. I always tell people the so-called business cycle is a pump and dump scheme. Because what was it? There was a commission, Picaro or there was some commission that investigated the Great Depression, right? And they determined that the bankers did it on purpose. Because, as you said, they make money going up the bubble and they make money from the burst that comes down. And of course, the money they're making from the burst that comes down is collecting all the collateral on all the loans, which in 1929 was, in just 1 year, was 200,000 farms, 4,000 banks, and, you know, all their assets, equipment, et cetera, land. And so that was how that wealth came up. But I was wondering what you, I always tell people it's a pump and dump scheme.
It was the GI Bill, and the GI Bill stimulated the monetary system through its real estate besides the grants to student loans, and that created a boom after World War II, which of course stimulated the monetary system because everybody could buy homes, which didn't have it.
Okay. Time to go on to Julia.
One more comment question. You talk about the economy. There's the real economy, and then there's where my 401k goes, which is not the real economy. And I think that's another reason why there isn't money available for real things. Most of the money is getting sucked out of the economy that you and I experience. And I think that's why there's not money left for infrastructure. It's going somewhere else. I know the money that I have in my 401k is not being used for anything. It's just sitting there.
You've probably said this other places and times. I'm just curious the correlation between population growth and debt service.
Yeah, population growth is an important driving force for the growth in consumption and waste production. The more people got to consume more things and produce more waste. So the population issue is always there. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, but it's always there. You're right.
I guess my point, the debt might increase just
basically because more people want debt or wanting products, so they create more money just to satisfy the preference of new people.
Well, that's very much the rationale for developing countries that are increasing their populations. And so the only way they see to do that is to grow the GDP. And so we have this problem of growth is the solution to all problems, all economic problems. And yeah, from a narrow point of view, economic point of view, it sort of works, but it doesn't look at the big picture in terms of the consequences of all that on a finite planet.
Okay, thank you for those fantastic questions, and some of them